We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Tensions are escalating in Korea as the Biden administration doubles down on its belligerent policy towards North Korea, carrying out military exercises utilizing nuclear-capable bombers earlier this week. Meanwhile, the Japanese government has caused alarm across the region by announcing a historic expansion in its war-making capacity. And people's movements in South Korea continue to challenge social injustice. Welcome to this week's episode of the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're joined by Ju-Hyun Park. Ju-Hyun Park is a writer and a member of Nodutdol for Korean Community Development and the engagement editor at The Real News. Welcome to the Socialist Program.
It's great to be here, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. The last time we spoke, we talked about the struggle of workers in South Korea, the struggle for economic and social justice. The struggle for justice in South Korea is very connected to the overall issues that affect Korea on the international scale. I'm talking about U.S.-North Korean relations, U.S.-South Korean relations, the relations between Japan, the former colonial power in Korea. But this week we want to start, and of course we want to get to the political, social, and class struggles going on in South Korea. But one of the things that I think jumps out at everybody is the escalating military tensions and threats, including the simulated destruction of North Korea by the U.S. Pentagon working jointly with the South Korean military. Not only carrying out the simulated invasion and destruction of North Korea, but as they leaked to the media, as the Pentagon leaked to the media a couple months ago, the simulated assassination of the head of state of North Korea. Anyway, this endless and growing provocations, what's causing it?
I think that's a great place to start, Brian. Thank you. It's been a very militarily active year in the Korean Peninsula. There have been, I believe, at this point, 60 missiles fired this year by the DPRK, which is a new single-year record. Of course, apart from that, there has been plenty of military activity from South Korea, from the United States as well. And I think really delving into that aspect of the dynamic is important to understanding what's happening presently. A lot of the headlines that folks are seeing are probably just emphasizing the military activities of North Korea or the DPRK. However, it's also been a year of a lot of saber rattling, a lot of military provocations from the US Korean side as well. The largest military exercises since 2017 happened this August, Operation Uji Freedom Shield. And there were also massive recent naval and aerial exercises that have been happening over the past couple of months, including just yesterday when the U.S. dispatched F-22 fighter jets to South Korean airspace as part of a show of force against North Korea. So what's happening presently needs to be placed in the context of a very long relationship between the United States. And that's been a very dangerous relationship that North Korea has had to navigate to survive. But it's also been a dynamic relationship in the sense that things do and have changed over time. And I think that's important to emphasize. We tend to get a one-note single story from mainstream media, but we need to understand that what is happening, a dynamic process that is changing over time to changing conditions. And right now, North Korea is responding to some of these changes or developments. The most important developments is diplomacy with the US. Korea has tried to engage the US 3 times over 3 decades, and each time North Korea has taken tangible steps to demonstrate good faith, relations and building peace in Korea. But every time they have not seen the process through. Recently, the talks with the Trump administration failed to really go anywhere meaningful for North Korea. And when the Biden administration came in, they did not take any initiative to do anything, offer anything better. Which brings me to the second important development, which is the continuing militarization of Korea by the US in collusion with South Korea's capitalist class. The military exercises I mentioned before are one aspect of this, but there's a lot more to the story. South Korea has also tested plenty of its own weapons over the past year, as has the US. New technologies like submarine launched ballistic missiles, is launching a Space Force, which is going to more or less be an appendage of the United States Space Force. The US has also announced just very recently, I believe last week, that they will be moving a Space Force outpost, the first overseas one, to Kherson Air Base. And when all this new military tech and expansion is constantly being introduced to Korea through the US military or the government of South Korea, North Korea has to keep pace. So this is an element that gets talked about outside of Korea. And there's a contradiction clearly between what the Korean governments say officially, which is dialogue, and what they do, which is to make military, to escalate militarily. And also many observers doubt the veracity of their words. So North Korea has reached a point where recently in September, the Supreme Assembly, which is the highest legislative organ in the country, passed a law saying that North Korea will no longer negotiate about its nuclear weapons program with foreign powers. And for the first time, they are declaring themselves a nuclear state. So for a generation, about 30 years, North Korea was open to diplomatic talks on denuclearization. And for a generation, the US gave North Korea the runaround. Now North Korea is saying that discussion is off the table. This is a really important, very intentional one. We're seeing it reflected in these new missile and satellite tests. North Korea recently tested a satellite launch, I believe last week. And what all this reflects is a shift towards a strategy that places more emphasis on deterrence. And some of these tests and military drills that we've seen from the North in the past few months have involved steps that they haven't taken in the past. One example is choosing to fire missiles while a US aircraft carrier was present in Korean waters. That occurred this past October. And North Korea is, what they're doing here is they're raising the risks assumed by the US when they conduct military operations. In the Pentagon's language, they call that their freedom, which is a euphemism for the freedom of the US military to go wherever it wants and do whatever it wants. North Korea's weapons tests are about limiting that while also sending a very clear message through laws, through their new law, that future dialogue needs to actually be about achieving peace instead of the US just making demands on North Korea.
One of the things that I think is extremely important for people to be able to comprehend and think about is that the danger of another Korean War is very real. And when you have the United States, the biggest military power in the world, threatening and simulating the destruction of North Korea and doing it in concert with South Korea, and the magnitude of these war exercises are vast. North Korea, because it was invaded, because it was, virtually destroyed by U.S. Air Force, by the U.S. Air Force between 1950 and 53, North Korea has to go on to high alert whenever one of these exercises, so-called war games, takes place. So the possibility of an accident, the possibility that there could be engagement that's very real. As you're pointing out, North Korea has now said and determined and made it official, we are a nuclear power, meaning we're not going back. Those days are over. And as it is increasingly threatened, is also carrying out satellite launches and missile experiments, missile tests in a way that could conceivably also hit U.S. Naval assets, as you're pointing out. The danger is real. And, I want to just remind everybody, if we had this discussion a year ago and said to our friends, our family members, our coworkers, look, there's going to be a major war in Ukraine in about 6 weeks or 7 weeks, most people would have thought, oh, that's not going to happen. But it did happen. And I just want to emphasize that the danger here is grave. And that makes the U.S. actions, the U.S. government's actions, even more despicable. Because when you know that war is possible, a major war, a war that could have not only obvious horrible consequences for the people of Korea and the people of the Asia Pacific, but even a global war, because We were very close to a global war in 1950 to 53. I mean, the recklessness of this policy, the hyper aggressiveness of this policy. And then when people in the United States read the media, they're always told the US is reacting to North Korean aggression, that North Korea is the aggressor, the provocateur, the one, disturbing the peace, when the reality is just the opposite. This is really uh, an Alice in Wonderland version of history, but most people believe it if they're getting their news from the mainstream media. All of that in combination makes this an extremely dangerous moment.
I couldn't agree more. We're in a situation where the relationship between North Korea, the South Korean government, and the U.S. has really deteriorated to a very unfortunate point. It's a pivot from where we were just a few years ago when there was the Panmunjom Declaration, the announcement and the agreement between the governments of North and South Korea to work towards building a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, to work towards ending the Korean War, and to announce their intention to do so. Um, in that year that Trump and Kim met in first in Hanoi and or Singapore and then Hanoi. Um, and at that time, it seemed like there was a lot of possibility for a sort of reset, a new way of approaching the relationship between North Korea and these other countries. Um, and I think the fact that we have gotten to such a nadir, such a low point this year, really speaks to the ineffectiveness of, or the effectiveness, depending on your perspective, of the U.S. approach to North Korea, which is to constantly place the emphasis on isolation, to constantly put this idea of a unilateral disarmament of North Korea as the goal of any kind of diplomatic engagement with that country. And the moment that we are in right now is, as you're saying, very volatile, because it's not only that we have these raised tensions in Korea. It's not only that we have these massive military exercises involving thousands of troops, all kinds of destructive military hardware, that at any time could escalate to a very violent and very unpredictable point. But it's also that the wider region is also filled with all kinds of sort of powder keg being created through the um, the really tremendous military presence that the U.S. has in Asia and in the Pacific, which is constantly grating at, constantly provoking um, a lot of the existing powers in the region, a lot of the rising powers such as China, um, and it's easy to think about any sort of tension or issue that's happening in one place as just a matter for just that country. But as you're saying, what's going to happen, or what could happen in Korea, will not only end up affecting the peninsula, it could spiral into a much wider regional conflict in one of the most, actually the most populated area on Earth. Um, and that could be disastrous for the lives of quite literally billions of people, and for our entire planet, in terms of the consequences and the spiraling effect that it could have upon the globe, as we're seeing from which the war in Ukraine is affecting uh, not only the livelihoods of people within that region, but really all around the world, as we see the blowback in terms of the effect on oil prices, prices of other commodities, and of course, these uh, the spread of military hardware that's being shipped over there in the name of aid and being found in places as far away as Central Africa, as these things just tend to feed a section, um, not only within one particular region but throughout the globe.
I had the opportunity to cover both the Singapore summit and the Hanoi summit for my show. And I can't overstate how much optimism there was from the International Press Corps. Luckily, I was with the International Press Corps, not the so-called American media, who are truly awful in the way they conducted themselves. But there was so much optimism that maybe the Korean War was actually going to end. Every war has a beginning. Almost every war has an end. The Korean War is the exception here. It began, in a technical way, on June 25th, 1950. Here we are, going on the 73rd anniversary, and the U.S. won't sign a peace treaty. And there they were, the head of state of the United States and the head of state of North Korea. In that case, it was Donald Trump. Oddly, that Donald Trump is the one initiating this process, or responding to North Korea's initiative to take up the possibility of peace, especially given how terrible Trump was in the beginning when he was insulting the North Koreans. He was threatening to decimate North Korea, but eventually he responded, and they went to the Singapore summit. And at that summit, they signed what was called the Singapore Summit Declaration. And on our show, we've read the points there many times, but I want to read them again, because point number one is not denuclearization. Point number one is this. I'm going to read the exact words. The United States and the DPRK, that's North Korea, commit to establish new U.S. DPRK relations in accordance with the desire of the people of the two countries for peace and prosperity. That's number one. Number two, the United States and the DPRK will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And point number three, this is and only point number three do we get to denuclearization. Point number three, reaffirming the April 27, 2018 Panmunjom Declaration, which is what you referred to. The DPRK commits to work towards complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, when the U.S. government signed that agreement with Kim Jong-un, Trump and Kim Jong-un signed it, the North Koreans unilaterally stopped carrying out nuclear weapons tests. They unilaterally carried out a suspension or moratorium of intercontinental ballistic missile tests and shorter range missile tests. They unilaterally blew up some of their nuclear facilities. In other words, they were taking positive actions to show the United States, to show the world that they really wanted peace. And the premise of it was not that they were going to disarm and get rid of all of their weapons while still being threatened. Point number one was that they, along with the United States, committed to establish a new relationship based on peace and prosperity and a peace regime in the Korean Peninsula. It's so obvious that what North Korea really wants is peace. It's so simple, so basic, so obvious, so observable, and so achievable. And yet it's this that the US government says no to. And even Trump was ridiculed by the Democrats and most of the Republicans for agreeing to this. And the US media also were, as I mentioned, despicable in the way they conducted themselves at the two summits. From your point of view, why will the United States not end the Korean War? Why will it not agree to have peaceful and normal relations when that's clearly what North Korea wants?
That's a great question, Brian. I think in a way, the US does want to end the Korean War. They just want the ending where the US achieves total victory. So that means the destruction of North Korea's government, the takeover of the economy for US capital, and the seizure of more Korean land for uses. They don't with North Korea to end the war for good because a sovereign socialist Korean government is against the interests of US imperialism. It's not just that the US is deeply invested in the Korean economy, which is immensely profitable for them, but Korea is a really important strategic military point for them to project military power throughout the entire region, which affects their ability to access the markets and the labor of really the entire continent of Asia, which, as we know, is the most populated continent. And so officially, the US says they do support reunification, but they want a particular version of reunification, preferably where the South simply absorbs the North. And ending the Korean War and achieving reunification under the present status quo at the North North Korean state continue to exist. It would continue to be a force that would need to be reckoned with, and North Korean society would remain organized. As long as that's the case, the US can't really achieve what it wants, which is to bring all of Korea into its orbit. And I think it's interesting to think about the Trump summits and what we can really learn from the way in which the US media and also the Democrats sort of reacted, and really some of the Republicans as well, reacted to those developments. It was very much sold to the American people, to the audiences of US media, as this moment of Trump just having this completely crazy idea that was totally inexplicable and a sign of um, his sort of like authoritarian personality, because it's always assumed that North Korea is sort of this ontologically totalitarian entity, and that any kind of engagement or any kind of recognition amounts to some kind of complicity with its alleged crimes. Um, and I think that examining that is really helpful to get us to understand the role of media and also the interests of the powers that be in Washington. Um, I think it was really the moment from the standpoint of U.S. interests to be engaging in those discussions to an extent, and I think uh, the fact that Trump was not the result of like his own erratic personality, but really it was the result of internal political developments in Korea, which is something that never really registers in the conversation as something that's worth thinking about, or something that
Mm.
is a really important dynamic of the way in which these politics are playing out. Um, to get a little bit more specific, as you mentioned, it was Kim Jong Un, the North Korean government, that extended the invitation to us. It was their idea. It was not the US's. And the reason why they were extending that invitation was because of improved relations with the South Korean government through the initiative of the government of Moon Jae-in, who really prioritized trying to increase cooperation and dialogue with the North. And through measures such as the Panmunjom Declaration, we're really trying to lay a roadmap, a blueprint for there to be a future process and an ongoing cooperative process towards reunification, which is not only an incredibly important issue, and I would argue the dream of the Korean people, but also I would say a historically inevitable process. Um, and I think that the way that the Trump administration conducted itself tells us a lot about what the U.S.'s interests really are at the end of the day. Trump was willing to,
Mm.
like fly all the way to Singapore, fly all the way to Hanoi, get the photo up with Kim Jong Un, but when it actually having the negotiations, the Hanoi ended early, and it ended after, I believe, only one conversation. And the reason was because the Trump administration came in and they basically said, okay, this is the deal that we're offering you. The deal is that you give up all of your nuclear weapons, all of your facilities, you completely disarm, um, and then we give you nothing. So it's a completely one sided way of engaging in negotiations. I wouldn't even call it negotiations, I would call it a shakedown in terms of the approach that the US government was taking. And this is very consistent with what past administrations have done in the past, and like sort of the reigning bipartisan view of how North Korea should be dealt with. And I think that brings me back to some of the points in the Singapore summit and sort of the misunderstanding of what it is exactly that North Korea wants. As you says, there's an emphasis on normalizing relations. There's an emphasis on establishing a security guarantee where North Korea no longer has to worry about these massive military exercises or other forms of provocation from the United States. But there's also the fourth provision of the Singapore summit, which is about the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, not the denuclearization of just North Korea. And I think that's an
Mhm.
important point to emphasize historically, because it was actually the United States that first introduced nuclear threats to Korea. First, during the Korean War itself, when President Eisenhower, President Truman, General MacArthur all made various threats and plans to actually use the atomic during that war. Um, and also after the fact, when nuclear warheads were stationed in South Korea itself from 1950 to 1991. So it's the US that introduced the nuclear dimension into the Korean conflict. On top of that, South Korea is under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. A nuclear umbrella is an agreement between two countries where one nuclear power says to a non nuclear power, yeah, we'll use our nukes essentially to defend you in a situation of war. Um, so that's a really crucial condition. Is also part of the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, if we put it in those terms. And by comparison, North Korea has never had a comparable agreement with any other foreign power. They've never had any kind of treaty or understanding where the Soviet Union or China would deploy their nukes in defense of North Korea. It's entirely been through their own initiative to develop their own program and responding to these very clear threats that are being created as a result of the machinations of the US military.
The North Korean military budget is actually quite small in comparison, of course, to the United States. It's about $4 billion or so, and the U.S. is spending almost $1 trillion. So just for people to wrap their heads around that. So North Korea's military budget is about the size of the New York City Police Department budget. But there is this other element in history where North Korea, in spite of the fact that it's a small country and a country that was ravaged by the legacy of colonialism and thus underdevelopment, actually fought the United States to a standstill. And in May 1953, the U.S. wanted to end the Korean War. Truman had left office as the most unpopular president ever. It's called the Forgotten War, mainly, unlike the Vietnam War, mainly because the left in the United States was so suppressed because of the witch hunt and the anti-communism. But anti-war sentiment was quite strong in the U.S., as it was during Vietnam. It was just a suppressed sentiment. And the U.S. in May 53, according to a book written by one of the authors is Michio Kaku, physicist from New York City, from the CUNY system and other places. He wrote, based on documents that had become released, 30-year-old documents, that the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff had agreed that they would drop nuclear bombs all over North Korea and parts of China unless North Korea signed an armistice agreement ending the conflict, because the U.S. couldn't win the war. The U.S. could not win the war, just the way it couldn't win the war in Vietnam. But they threatened to have nuclear annihilation of North Korea unless there was an armistice. And I'm pretty sure the North Koreans didn't want to sign that agreement. I think the North Koreans had the same view as the North Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese, let's call it the Vietnamese people, which was they were prepared to fight and fight and fight and fight until they drove the occupiers out of their country. But perhaps it was China, or perhaps it was pressure from the Soviet Union and China that wanted, understandably, to avoid global nuclear war. That pressure was brought to bear, and an armistice was signed. Now, what that shows anybody who's paying attention is that North Korea, even if it has a so-called weak hand, they're not going to give up. They're not going to surrender. They're not going to say, "Oh yeah, you know what, Uncle, we're done. We're done fighting." It's like really a big part of who North Korea is and who the Korean people are, which is to want to be free of foreign occupation. And I think that one of the reasons I'm telling some of this history is mostly people in the United States, unless you're Korean, won't know it. And people won't know like what the dynamic is here. And it's really important to understand that North Korea is not only a socialist government led by a Marxist or a communist party. It's part of this global trend of national liberation that became so pronounced at the end of World War II and really changed the face of the globe in a way that can't be unchanged. Like, people are just not going to go back. And that's the mix, so that you have this U.S. recalcitrance, obstinacy, aggression, feeling that they can ultimately wear North Korea down, and ultimately they will succeed. And the North Koreans, knowing this, are determined not to let that happen. And so we have this sort of pitched, enduring rivalry. And it's really important for people who are anti-war or progressive or left to understand the dynamic, to understand also that this isn't just two belligerent governments, but they represent different social, class, and political forces. Go ahead.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think that a lot of the misunderstanding of North Korea comes from a failure to understand the historical process that was taking place at the time of the division of the Korean Peninsula. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Korea was coming off of 35 years of official Japanese colonialism, which, in my view, was also preceded by decades of other kinds of imperialist subjugation. But there was a especially brutal period where for a generation Korea was a colony of Japan. And as empires do in colonies everywhere, what this really meant is, as you're saying, Korea's underdevelopment, or really the seizure of its economy, its means of production, the productive forces there for the benefit of Japanese imperialist cap, not for the development of Korea as a country. Um, and so when the moment came at the end of World War II, where Japan had been defeated, which was also not only because of the initiative of the United States and their military prowess, but also because of the long war that had been fought in Asia itself, within China, within Korea, at the end with the Soviet Union, by our comrades in Southeast Asia, in order to eject Japanese imperialism, and that was really the process that brought about the defeat of the Empire of Japan. But at the moment of liberation, that was really a time of decolonization throughout the Korean Peninsula. It was a moment where it was widely understood that what needed to happen was that the Japanese imperialists needed to be kicked out. All of the land that they had taken needed to be taken back and distributed amongst the peasantry. And that was really the movement that what became the government of North Korea was representing. One of the first things that happened in the North was land reform. It was the redistribution, it was the seizure and redistribution of land that had been formerly held by the Japanese colonizers, by their lackeys and their support within Korean society, including the very, very parasitic class that existed, and really redistributing land to a country that was mostly peasantry. And on top of that, peasants who did not have land of their own, peasants who were tenants, and therefore were extremely burdened through both colonial taxes and the taxes imposed on them by the landlords. Um, and so, what decolonization meant was that if colonization is the seizure of the productive forces of your society by an occupying foreign power, then decolonization is when you take control of those productive forces back, when you take control of your destiny back. And that was really what was unfolding in the North. When and what the United States did comparatively in the South, which it's important to note, the U.S. ruled Southern Korea directly through the U.S. military for 3 years, which is something that many Americans do not know. And effectively, what this meant is that Southern Korea was first a colony of Japan and then transferred to being a colony of the United States. The U.S. military's policy was just to rule through the same colonial bureaucrats, the same colonial police that had served Japanese empire. So they really kept the apparatus of the colonial government intact. And then in order to run the southern half of the country, they allied with the same social forces that had allied or been dependent on Japanese imperialism during the era of more formal colonialism. So that's these same landlords. It's this class of capitalists who would go on to become the Samsungs and the LGs of the world. Um, and it's really this class distinction, the difference in the class stance and the social groups that these different emerging governments represented. That is really part of what became the Korean War, which was really a civil war in a post-colonial society between different social classes that had different relations to that process of colonialism. And that is what the US intervened within and has fought to preserve in terms of the rule of the Korean bourgeoisie, the interests of U.S. and also Japanese finance capital against um, the government in the North, which was representing the will of the peasantry and then the emerging proletariat.
I want to go back to something that you had mentioned towards the beginning of the show, which was that this was not the Trump dialogue or discussion or fake negotiations, however one might want to characterize it, with Kim Jong Un in Singapore and Hanoi and elsewhere, that it wasn't the first time. And you were also making the point that U.S. orientation towards North Korea is also, at least in part, impacted by, and maybe dominantly impacted by, what's going on in South Korea and in South Korean politics. So, one of the other times that the US actually engaged in what appeared to be negotiations towards, in the direction of normalization, was at the very end of the Clinton administration. And again, for our audience, in 1984, there was a near war between the US and North Korea. The US, that was following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the socialist bloc basically disappeared, at least in Europe. And the US felt in this hyper aggressive stance, and they thought North Korea would be collapsed. And North Korea made it clear it wasn't going to. And then at the last minute, Jimmy Carter actually went and met with Kim Il Sung shortly before Kim Il Sung died. And Kim Il Sung is for those who don't know, is the sort of the founder and first leader of the DPRK, North Korea. But then a few years later, right at the end of the Clinton administration, Clinton starts to negotiate with North Korea. Madeleine Albright, who at that time was Secretary of State, went to the DPRK. There was what looked like maybe an end to the Korean War. But at that same time, there was this profound change in South Korean politics where Kim Dae-jung was the president. He was an advocate for what they called at that time the Sunshine Policy. And there was the summit, the June 15th summit, where the two Koreas met together and pledged that they would bring reunification, however that was going to be defined, on the Korean Peninsula. And then George W. Bush came into office, and Clinton didn't normalize the relations. George W. Bush came into the office, and he immediately started trashing the South Korean president, the liberal/progressive president, Kim Dae-jung. Treated him very rudely when he came to the White House in March 2002, I believe it was, or maybe it was March 2001, actually. And in other words, made it clear that the U.S. wasn't going to tolerate that anymore. Anyway, there's this dialectical connection between U.S. policy, which is belligerent and almost always constant, and South Korean politics, which does change based on what's going on internally, domestically, politically in the country. So let's pursue that a little bit more, because right now, as the escalation of threats is growing and the danger of war is growing, there's a new government in South Korea. Moon Jae-in is no longer president. He obviously was the one promoting, very vigorously promoting, along with the North Korean leadership, the idea that there should be normalization of relations on the peninsula. So anyway, let's go back into that topic a little bit more, if we could.
Yeah, absolutely. So South Korea elected a new president this spring, Yoon Suk-yeol. I think one thing I would note is that this was by the thinnest margin in Korea, and I mean both Koreas, in terms of the actual mandate that Yoon Suk-yeol has. It was less than 1% of the vote that brought him to power. Yoon Suk-yeol is from the People's Power Party, which is a strange name for the right-wing party of South Korea, but that's their name. And he represents, in my view, a very reactionary strain and kind of like a new sort of like generation of South Korea's right wing as well. And this is, really across the board, whether we're talking about social issues or kind of like quote unquote domestic things, or, like when it comes to his international stances, which are very anti-China, anti-DPRK. He's trashed the process of reconciliation that was driven by his predecessor, Moon Jae-in. And he's been a very stalwart supporter of really towing the U.S. line, strengthening the military alliance with the United States, and also seeking to build closer ties with Japan as well, which for some pretty obvious historical reasons, which we just kind of went over, is a really big problem for a lot of Korean people because a lot of what Japan did to Korea has not been settled either in terms of formal recognition, in terms of many forms of reparations or restitution for the various crimes that were exacted on the Korean people or for the immense wealth that was extracted from Korea. Um, but with that being said, Yoon Suk Yeol has definitely had a very negative effect on inter-Korean relations in that uh, incoming in, it sent a very clear signal to the North Korean government that okay, so we've reached a point now where we have a government in the South that is now going to be outrightly hostile towards us. And so the way in which that we navigate the international situation needs to take that circumstance in mind. Yoon Suk Yeol has been a big proponent of what is known in the South Korean military as the kill chain doctrine. The kill train, the kill chain, sorry, is um, a military strategy that emphasizes the use of preemptive strikes against the North in the event of a suspected attack. Big highlight on the word suspected. We know how that can go given the history of wars all over the world, and particularly terrorism is in the mix. Um, but that really, I think, like raised the temperature on the Korean Peninsula quite considerably. Things had already been deteriorating because the Trump administration had really bungled this opportunity for dialogue and concerted diplomacy with. Um, and at the same time, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, South Korea was, undergoing this process of increasing militarization, which it is still undergoing. This is something that was especially intensified under the previous Moon Jae-in government, which I think is one indication of the limitations of governments are able to do within a bourgeois democracy. Still a lot of forces that are pushing for increased militarization, increased war, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and the introduction of Yoon Suk Yeol and his emphasis on the kill chain doctrine really forced North Korea to change its calculus because they already had a situation where um, the possibilities of dialogue with the South Korean government and the U.S. were deteriorating day, and then with his entry, the stakes were all raised, and I think regionally at the same time, Biden has undertaken an escalation throughout the Pacific, which was initiated by Trump, but he's continued it and is primarily centered around China. But from North Korea's standpoint, encirclement is encirclement, right? If the U.S. is building up its military forces in the region more widely, that is just as much of a problem for North Korea as it is when it's happening directly on the Korean Peninsula, which itself is geographically not that huge. So what is done in neighboring countries and throughout the region generally is of real importance from for all kinds of dimensions and consequences for what it could have for the Korean people.
Let's talk about what's going on politically with the new administration in South Korea. There have been a lot of strikes. I was looking at Nodutdol's, your organization's website. You're talking about the trucker strike. There's been lots of social and class struggles in South Korea. South Korea's got a very dynamic political scene where people are organized. They're very active. There's a lot of political engagement. I'm less familiar with it, of course, not being Korean, not speaking Korean, but to having some interaction. I've always been impressed with the dedication and the determination, and in spite of all odds, the resilience of the progressive forces in South Korea, who literally were routinely sent to prison and routinely tortured for decades for doing things that would be in the United States have been considered to be, the exercise of basic free speech rights. That could land you in prison for 10 years, 5 years under the national security law. Torture was very routine. Anyway, it's a dynamic movement, and it's workers and it's young people, it's farmers. Let's just talk about how after Moon Jae-in and with the new government, like what the level is of sort of political organizing.
I would say that yeah, there's as you're saying, South Korea has a very dynamic political scene. I think a lot of that owes to the history of the country. South Korea is often lifted up as this example of all the great things that capitalism and liberal democracy can bring to developing nations. But when you actually examine that history, it's actually a history of military dictatorship. It's a history of fascism. It's a history where the state partnered very closely with the capitalist class native to Korea and to with the U.S. military in order to create really ideal conditions for the super exploitation of its workforce. During the 1980s, which is the big decade of boom in South Korea when it really started to pull ahead as a global economy, South Korea had literally the longest work hours in the world, and it still has one of the highest rates of workplace accidents, at least among OECD countries that you can find anywhere on the planet to this day. And one consequence of that as well, because of this massive political repression, because of all of this intense labor exploitation, is that the workers' movement played a very important role in South Korean history in terms of standing up to and providing political resistance against the various US backed military dictators, in terms of providing the social force that really achieved the transition to a more open form of liberal democracy than existed previously. But as we can see, there are limitations to kind of system is really able to um, achieve for South the South Korean people. And in terms of what is going on right now, the workers' movement is continuing to play a really important role presently in what we're seeing. There was, as you mentioned, the trucker strike that happened recently, where tens of thousands of truckers struck for over 10 days. They were striking from uh, in order to achieve fairer pay, in order to have less dangerous work conditions, and really responding to the squeezing of the truck drivers that's happening as globally economic trends are looking downward. And I think it's worth noting that they were also met with pretty intense repression. They were not only threatened with big fines, but also jail. And in spite of that, they actually continued striking after the initial threat for a few days. Um, so, as I'm saying, the workers' movement is playing a very important role. The Korean Truckers Union is part of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is one of the two large umbrella union organizations that exists in South Korea. Of course, there's also a lot of other political opposition to Yoon that is primarily being whipped up by extreme Liberal Party. And a lot of that is drawing on various civil society organizations, which do exist in South Korea and like have a lot of wide influence. Um, and a lot of it is responding to a lot of avoidable gaffes and like disasters that have happened under Yoon's watch just in these past 6 months. There's a wide range of issues from problems of corruption within his family, as well as to the recent Itaewon disaster, which happened on Halloween
Mm.
night, where 158 people were killed in one of the party areas of Seoul. And it was later found that there was a dearth of public safety officials present um, at one of the busiest nights of the year in a very crowded part of the city that historically, has a lot of twisting alleyways because of the kind of haphazard sort of development that happened in Seoul after the war. And the reason that police were not present on the streets is because they had been diverted in order to provide security for the president, President Yoon, who has refused to move into the official residence of the South Korean government. Um, and that's for various complicated reasons. It's like part of his image as an outsider. But what it's meant functionally is that he has just kind of picked a very central part of the city, and then resources that are intended for or supposed to be intended for um, the execution of public safety are then going towards the protection of just the president. And then so uh, this horrific disaster that claimed the lives of hundreds of young people was completely avoidable. And it's really because of this kind of naked incompetence and self-serving sort of approach of the Yoon government that all the lives of these young people were so tragically lost. And so we've seen a lot of reaction to that tragedy, a lot of political blame that's been placed on the Yoon government. Um, and it's not only that these big scandals, but also I do think that the approach that the Yoon government is taking, both towards the U.S. military and the DPRK, is fueling a lot of the opposition to him, because it is so clear to anyone in Korea that this is only making the situation worse. Regardless of what people individually think about North Korea or about socialism, they're able to see that like, we're getting better for a time, and now you came and you things have gone way downhill. Um, and on top of that, is pursuing a lot of very strict anti-worker policies that are not just about repressing individual strikes. One of the big achievements of the previous Moon Jae-in government was the reduction of South Korea's work hours to a maximum of 52 work hours a week. Yoon is now talking about raising that back up to 80 and a half hours a week as a maximum. Um, so he's pursuing all kinds of policies that are taking a real toll on Korean workers, that are the situation in Korea itself way more vile. And, he just has a very sort of like unctuous and kind of narrow-minded personality and way of governing that is really rubbing a lot of people in incredibly wrong ways, and also in the case of the Itaewon disaster, um, having really tragic and completely avoidable consequences for the Korean people as well. Um, so there is a lot of opposition to him that is being whipped up. I think, to characterize it, there is an independent workers movement that I would say is really being pushed through by the KCTU. There's a lot of political opposition that is mainly being corralled within the mainstream Liberal Democratic Party. Sorry, that's not the name of the party, but I'm placing liberal there to help people understand, which parties we're talking about. Um, and um, yeah, I think that the opposition is widespread. In terms of the degree of unity that there is, I think that we can say that there are various forces that are sort of pulling at that movement in different directions, sort of at times seeking different aims in terms of what they're exactly seeking to accomplish. Of course, the opposition party is mainly concerned with no longer being the opposition party and becoming the dominant party, and the interests of the organized workers do and don't align with that at various points.
Okay, let's find out about Nodutdol. Who are your members? If people want to join, how do they do that? How can people learn more about your work or show support for your work?
Yeah, so Nodutdol for Korean Community Development was founded in 1999 by Koreans in diaspora in order to really fight for the reunification and national liberation of our country, and carry on that in the US, and also to seek the end of imperialism. So you can find us by visiting our website, nodutdol.org, Nodutdol. You can also find us on social media at that handle, at if you're interested in joining Nodutdol, yes, please reach out to us over socials. We also have a link tree in the bio of our Instagram page, which should have a link to a membership form that you're welcome to fill out as well. And then we'll get back to you when we're able to. And yeah, we're always looking to continue growing, continue organizing. We believe that organizing Korean people in the U.S. To fight for the end of imperialism, to fight for the reunification of our country, is one really solid way that we can make a contribution towards really fighting for a better world, fighting for um, the end of capitalism, and the creation of a new life-giving system where we can actually center human need over profits, and prioritize peace over war, and really just build the future that we all deserve.
Ju-Hyun Park, thank you so much for joining the Socialist Program.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Pleasure to be here.